Deep in the Kentucky wilderness, near what would become Bardstown, south of Louisville, many Revolutionary War veterans would find their new home. One of them was John Ash and his family. He had a wife, a few sons, and a daughter. One of those sons was 10-year-old George Ash. Life was quiet on the frontier for a while, but the settlers knew the Indians and built fortifications just in case. In March of 1780, John Ash, with his wife, and with their infant son, Henry, went on a supply run north to Clarksville. They left the rest of their children in the care of some neighbors. While they were gone, a Shawnee raiding party fell upon the settlement and set some fires to smoke out the defenders. Many were killed and the rest captured. George and his 3-year-old sister were hiding in some brush during the raid. His sister let out a whimper and the Shawnee raiders snatched them both up. The Shawnee divided up the captives and the loot. George's older brothers were taken away, while he and his sister were kept together in a separate party. After the settlement was plundered and burned, they made their way north up the Ohio. They carried Ash's sister for a couple days, but she kept crying and making noise. After they had enough, they killed her with a tomahawk, removed her scalp, and left her body in the wild. George, fearing the same treatment, didn't make a sound. When they arrived at a Shawnee town, George was passed from family to family and often abused, referred to as a white dog. Eventually, he settled with a family and was formally adopted into the tribe. After this, all the abuse ceased, and he was treated just like any other child in the community. The Shawnee town they lived in at the time was along the Miami River in what is now Dayton, Ohio. This was until George Rogers Clark attacked and destroyed the town, forcing the Shawnee to move west into Indiana. They were attacked again, this time by General Harmer, and moved to the Auglaize River. Over the next decade, George Ash would become fully acculturated to the Shawnee people. He learned their songs, played their games, wore their clothes, and spoke the language fluently, almost to the point of forgetting English. Even took a Shawnee wife named She-Bear. When he was old enough, he would take part in their raids. On the riverways, the Shawnee raiders would use George as a decoy for passing flatboats. He would wave his arms, pretending to be a poor captive who just escaped the Indians. When they got close enough, the raiders would attack and plunder the boat. In the fall of 1791, Miami Chief Little Turtle, along with Shawnee Chief Blue Jacket, organized a force consisting of several nations to attack an invading army of Americans near the Wabash River. George Ash would join his Shawnee brothers in this fight. He wouldn't be the only white Indian present at the battle. William Wells, the son-in-law of Little Turtle, fought alongside the Miami, and Simon Girty was also said to be present at the battle, fighting with the Wyandots. American forces under the command of General Arthur St. Clair camped near the present-day Indiana-Ohio border. The native forces formed a large crescent formation and like a massive jaw closed in and surrounded the camp. After about 3 hours, the Americans were totally defeated. A quarter of the U.S. Army of that time was annihilated in one day. Unfortunately for St. Clair, the Battle of the Wabash would be commonly known as St. Clair's defeat. Ash himself had a close call during the engagement when a ball passed through the back of his neck. When he fell, his fellow warriors carried him off the battlefield to safety. After the great victory, Ash joined a diplomatic mission to the Creek Nation. While he was away, fighting between the Northwest Confederacy and the United States continued. By the time Ash returned, General Anthony Wayne established Fort Recovery with a professional army. Another army was organized to fight off the Americans, which Ash joined. On their way to Fort Recovery, they captured a Chickasaw man who was spying for General Wayne. He was interrogated, but killed before he could spell all the details. The food supply for the Native American army was extremely low, due to some harsh winters and bad crops. A group of Chippewa Indians took the body of the Chickasaw scout, roasted it over fire, and ate him. General Wayne would eventually defeat the Northwest Confederacy in 1794 at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Then, in the next year, the Treaty of Greenville was signed, and then there was peace, at least for a while. George Ash finally had the time and opportunity to seek out the answers to the questions that had been eating away at his heart after all these years. What happened to his family? What about his brothers? Are his parents still alive? At this point, he had been living with the Shawnee for 17 years. He talked with his elders and expressed his desire to seek out the white settlements and find his original family. They didn't like the idea at first, but eventually gave George their blessing and provided a rifle, a horse, and a decent hunting dog. Ash traveled east, across Ohio country, and made his way to Fort Pitt. There, he took on a job as a guide and interpreter. After a while, he managed to track down one of his brothers, and learned that his father was still alive and well in Kentucky. With this information, he sold his horse and traveled down the Ohio River to Kentucky, and found his father's residence. He reached the home in the evening and called out requesting lodging for the night. John Ash invited him in, thinking he was just another traveler. His appearance made him a little uneasy, so he didn't pay much attention to him. George was still dressing like a Shawnee at the time. His skin was painted, his nose perforated with crescent moons, and silver-jeweled piercings lined his ears. George began to ask his father about the Ash family. He learned that his mother had died and his father remarried. He appeared to be doing quite well for himself after all this time. He owned a few slaves and had a good amount of horses. Finally, he asked if he had a son named George, who was taken by the Shawnee many years ago. John Ash said that he did, but he heard that he died in St. Clair's defeat. George stood up and told him what he heard was incorrect. His father became eager to hear what this supposed traveler knew about his son. He told him, "George Ash stands before you now." John looked at his long-lost son in disbelief. George was able to confirm his identity with either a scar or a birthmark. His father asked him if he would recognize his son Henry if he saw him, and George reminded him that Henry was just an infant when he was taken away, so it was unlikely. Turns out Henry didn't live too far away, so he was invited over, and finally he was reunited with his older brother, whom he thought was dead this whole time. Sadly, this family reunion was short-lived. John Ash's second wife, named Arabella, didn't want anything to do with this savage who showed up on their doorstep, calling himself George Ash. George's history with the Indians and his participation in their depredations may have also been a factor in their decision to send him away. It turns out, George had a brother killed at St. Clair's defeat, fighting on the opposite side with the Americans. Rejected by his father, unable to reunite with his mother, George Ash, heartbroken, decided to return to his Shawnee family. When he returned, he was recruited for another important diplomatic mission, this time to the east to see the Great Father, or whom we call the President of the United States. Ash was likely an interpreter. For compensation, the Shawnee granted Ash 600 acres along the Ohio River in southeast Indiana. The Shawnee civil chief Blackhoof vouched for Ash in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, but he was never given a deed or a title. When the region was ceded to the United States, his grant wasn't reserved, and he was forced to petition Congress. His claim was denied, but Congress gave him the opportunity to purchase back the land, and so he did, but he can only afford about half of it. This put George in the hole a bit and made him house poor, or land poor in this case. A deed, signed by President James Madison, made the property official. With a few of his Shawnee buddies, George built a red brick house on the property, which is still there today. Despite his return to the Shawnee, George could see how things were going and that the indigenous ways were fading. He determined that he would have a greater advantage living as a white man. His Shawnee family made one request, which was simply stop by and visit every now and then, and invite your Shawnee brothers over to your place every once in a while, which George Ash did. Somewhere along the way, he ended his marriage to She-Bear, and he began his search for a white woman. He started dressing like a white man to fit in better, though some say he just couldn't let go of some of his silver jewelry that the Shawnee were so fond of. Eager for a simple and honest living, Ash started a ferry boat business, with only a simple dugout canoe. He carried travelers across the Ohio between Kentucky and Indiana. On one of these boat rides, he met Hannah Combs, who would become his wife. Though not every boat ride had pleasant passengers. In one incident, Ash was transporting a family across the river, and a woman looked at George's face and screamed, claiming that this was the man who cut off a piece of her scalp many years ago. Her husband grabbed a boat hook and went after Ash, who jumped into the Ohio, swam to shore, and hid in some brush until the family moved on. Some just couldn't leave George's Indian past in the past. Eventually, he married Hannah Combs, and they had 2 children, a son named George, who they called Colonel, and a daughter named Eliza, who tragically drowned when she was around 7 years old. The ferry boat would eventually upgrade from a dugout canoe to a flatboat. When Colonel Ash grew up, he continued the family business. The Lamb-Carrollton ferryboat service would operate for 106 years, ending in the early 1920s. going from a simple dugout canoe to a flatboat to steamboats and ended with gas-powered boats. George Ashe died on October 3rd, 1850. He is buried in Switzerland County, Indiana. George shared his life story with the Cincinnati Chronicle in 1829, and it was featured in Turner's Trait of Indiana Character. And thus ends the story of Indian George Ashe. This has been Frontier Lore. Thank you for watching, and as always, take care.